앉으세요. 앞에 좌석이 아직 비어 있습니다.
One last cry, one last cry before I leave it all behind. I gotta put you out of my mind for the very last time. Been living a lie, I guess I'm down, oh yeah, I guess I'm down, oh yeah, I guess I'm down.
네, 여러분 지금부터 피스바 국제학술회의 기조강연 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 참석해 주신 여러분들 대단히 감사합니다. 오늘 기조강연을 해주실 분은 프레드 달마야 교수님입니다. 달마야 교수님에 대해서 간단히 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 달마야 교수님은 1955년도에 독일 뮌헨 대학에서 법학으로 박사학위를 받으셨고 1960년도에 미국 듀크 대학교에서 정치학으로 두 번째 박사학위를 받으셨습니다. 현재는 미국 노틀담 대학의 정치학, 철학 교수님으로 재직하고 계십니다. 오늘 강연은 정치적 몸, 잃은 것과 얻은 것이라는 주제로 말씀해 주시겠습니다. 여러분 달마야 교수님 나오실 때 뜨거운 박수로 환영해 주시길 바랍니다. Dr. Dallmayr, could you please come forward to the podium, please?
Well, thank you very much, Professor King, for your kind words of introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here. Before coming here, I did not know much. Before coming here, I did not know much about Gwangyi University. But now, learning about it more and more, I am even more happy that this is the place where I have been invited to. And especially I'm happy that I'm here for the occasion of the 2011 Peace Bar Festival. Now you see, peace to me means a whole lot. It is not an abstract concept. When I was a little boy, when I was 10, 12 years old, I experienced war. I experienced catastrophe. I lived the Second World War. I grew up in a city which was in ruins. I grew up in a city which was destroyed. So I experienced catastrophe, and it's in my body. So to be at a peace festival, I can tell you, this is a great occasion because peace is really bar, B-A-R, and I have been explained, I've been told what it actually means. B-A-R meaning beautiful, affluent, rewarding. Well, I can tell you that peace leads to beauty in the sense the arts are cultivated, music, dance, as we saw this morning. All the great accomplishments of culture are possible in the time of peace. And of course, peace also leads to commerce, to negotiation, so leads to some kind of affluence. And in all of this, peace is eminently rewarding. It leads to happiness, it leads to well-being, it leads to what Aristotle called the good life. So, bar, yes, indeed, peace is bar, believe me. So I'm very happy to be here also at the university which initiated 30 years ago in 1981 the annual Peace Day, United Nations Peace Day, which has now been celebrated for 30 years. This is an important date for me, 1981. There's another important date for me, this is 2001, just 10 years ago, when the United Nations decided to establish a year of the dialogue of civilizations, which is also a year of peace. So I have been very closely associated with the idea of a dialogue of civilizations, an idea which had been introduced by the then president of the Republic of Iran, President Khatami, and I have been associated with peace movements and also dialogue of civilization movements ever since that time. Now today I would like to talk to you about the body politic and its fortunes and misfortunes. Now, as a motto, as an epigram, I put at the head of my paper a statement by a Chinese philosopher, a Chinese Confucian sage of the 1600s by the name of Zheng Hao. And this statement reads, "The humane person, or the good person, the Jinzi, the humane person regards heaven and earth and all the myriad things as one body, as one body." Now, looking at contemporary humanity, one can hardly avoid the impression of a huge body or organism ravaged by multiple diseases and even catastrophes. Even without a detailed diagnosis, it is not hard to trace these ailments to a number of underlying factors, such as political oppression, domination, radical inequality between the rich and the poor, xenophobia, sometimes resulting in genocide, terrorism, and also the abuse of religions and ideologies. Now, if such ailments or illnesses occurred on a small scale or in a limited number of people, efforts would quickly be made to find remedies to combat these existing ills. However, if they happen on a large scale, in nations or in a global community, then fatalism often takes over, backed up by the argument that ailments of this magnitude must be the work of an inscrutable destiny or perhaps be divinely ordained. What is correct about this argument that these ailments are not just mental phenomena or matters of opinion, but are sufferings inflicted on multitudes of people seen as concretely embodied human beings. Here might be the beginning of what we might call a natural philosophy of politics, which treats the natural body politic as the presupposition of our study. Now, in ancient times, as you know, human societies were typically seen as tightly knit, homogeneous entities, perhaps as bodies, as organisms, frequently dominated by a king or a supreme ruler. During the Middle Ages, at least the Christian Middle Ages, Western societies were governed by a combination of worldly and spiritual rule, and some people spoke at the time of the king's two bodies. So the body politic was actually composed of two bodies, a physical body and a spiritual body, the king's two bodies. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, the people at large were slowly awakened from what Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, called the slumber of tutelage, and began to discover their role as political agents and not simply as victims of public events. The result was a series of dramatic social political changes, revolutionary upheavals. The sequence of changes is often interpreted as a process, what is called, of secularization, involving the growth of agnostic belief. However, this reading, in my view, is misleading. What really happened in modernity, or the modernizing process, was rather that political agency was predominantly construed as an instrumental agency, as an instrumental fabrication, as the construction of the construction of the body politic as an artificial body through contractual design. Now for the translator, I changed the page 2 a little bit, but I will catch up again on page 3 for you. Now here we have the signature model or the signature conception of modern Western political thought, a conception which views the political community, or the state as we call it, as an artificial body, an artifact, created through a social contract. This is the signature, the typical model of Western political thought, modern Western political thought. Artifact created through a social contract, a conception, of course, which was articulated in different ways. Now, in my talk, I shall, in the first step, discuss this conception of the body politic as it was developed by a number of thinkers, modern Western thinkers, starting with Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher Thomas Hobbes, continuing to John Locke and to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So that's the main conception of modern Western politics, of the body politic as an artifact constructed through social contract. In a second step, I try to show how during the 19th century, chiefly under the influence of positivism and a certain kind of scientism, politics and political agency were increasingly treated as an empirical process subject to quasi-scientific laws. And by way of conclusion, I turn to more recent developments in the 20th century, 20th and now 21st century, when partly under the impact of such tendencies or trends as phenomenology, hermeneutics, and neo-Aristotelianism, when efforts were made to overcome these older conceptions, the conception of the body politics either as an artificial construct or as simply a physical organism. What emerges, or what is rediscovered in recent times, is the notion of a political community, or as a body politic, as a shared embodied praxis, or as an affective interbody, what is sometimes called an interbody, or relational body. Okay, I'm now on page 3 for the translator. The body politic as an artifact. One of the crucial presuppositions of ancient and classical thought was that human beings are social or political creatures, and that hence political communities were at least to some extent natural bodies or organisms. During the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, for instance, translated Aristotle's notion of the political animal, the zoon politikon, into that of a social animal, but without significant change of meaning. It was the rise in the late Middle Ages of what is called anti-essentialism or voluntarism that began to undermine this traditional or classical conception of the body politic as a natural organism. The decisive step in this respect was taken by Thomas Hobbes, who took direct aim, who challenged directly the Aristotelian or classical conception of politics. His book, called De Cive, of 1642, uses bold and uncompromising language, and I cite now Thomas Hobbes. The greatest part of those, he says, who have written about the commonwealths either suppose or require or beg us to believe that man is a creature born fit for society. The Greeks called him a zoon politikon, that means a political animal. And on this foundation, or on this axiom, they built their doctrine of politics and civil society. And he adds, but this is an axiom which, although received by most people, is yet certainly false, and an error proceeding from our too slight contemplation of human nature. End of quote. Now, for Hobbes, those who inquire more deeply into the reasons why people gather actually into societies, he says, shall easily find that this happens not because they naturally it could not happen otherwise, so that people are naturally political or social animals, but rather it happens by accident or by deliberate design. Now, somewhat disarmingly, Thomas Hobbes, and I'm at the bottom of page 3, Thomas Hobbes acknowledges a certain performative contradiction, what one calls a performative, where in the saying you seem to contradict yourself. Namely, the fact that his argument proceeds in a societal or political context from which it, however, tends to abstract or claims to be aloof. He even speaks of, and I quote him, a wonderful kind of stupidity seemingly involved in the strategy of placing at the very threshold of his argument this stumbling block of denying that human beings are social animals, born fit for society. Now, deftly, Thomas Hobbes here shifts the accent from men's social nature to the nature or character of what he calls a pre-social, pre-political individuals. And he finds the wellspring of the behavior of such pre-social individuals purely in pleasure and pain. That is, in the striving for individual benefit or advantage and the fear of resulting consequences. Basically, this relentless striving for individual gain or utility leads human beings necessarily into conflict and violent strife, which Hobbes, in defiance of the entire Aristotelian tradition, calls the state of nature. So the state of nature as a state of strife, of conflict, of warfare, not as in this case of Aristotle, as a case of peace, where people are naturally social or political animals living at peace with each other. So, in defiance of this Aristotelian tradition, he defines the state of nature as a state of conflict. And the fear of the consequences of this conflict leads human beings back into society by means of a deliberate and rationally designed agreement, or what he calls a social contract. So it's only social contract which leads us back into a political community or a body politics. Without this contract, we would live in a state of war. So it's a total denial, an overturning of the entire classical tradition of politics. Now, in Hobbes' stern and very anti-traditional language, he says, human beings do not by nature seek society for its own sake. Rather, they seek society for an extrinsic purpose so that they may receive some benefit from it. Hence, honor and profit we desire primarily. Now, that's typical Hobbes language. Honor and profit we desire primarily by nature. We desire society only as an after effect or secondarily. Primarily we seek advantage, profit, which leads to conflict. Only secondarily we desire social life. However, unless restrained, striving for personal benefit does not lead to social harmony, but rather, as he says, to the war of all against all, which is a source of fear. So he says, we must therefore resolve, or we must conclude, that the original motive of all great and lasting societies consists not in the mutual goodwill men have toward each other, but in the mutual fear they have of each other. So it's fear which drives us into society, not mutual goodwill. Now, the motivations leading to the construction of social and political life are developed, of course, more fully in Thomas Hobbes' famous Leviathan of 1651. The first part of that text is devoted to the study of man or human nature, and especially of the interior beginnings or voluntary motions called the passions. Thomas Hobbes here reaffirms the basic division of passions into desires and fear, where the former mean a movement towards something which causes it, and the latter a motion fromward or away from something. I'm on page 5, please. This division, in the next step, is shown to be the engine driving human beings into society and the formation of the body politic. The impulse would be negligible if human desire were limited, but this is not the case. As he says, I put forth as a general inclination of all humankind a perpetual, restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death. That's Thomas Hobbes' vintage statement. Now, this restlessness of desire leads to the well-known result of violent strife, the state of war. Hobbes describes this condition of strife in stark language and vivid images, images which seem to derive from his own experiences in the English Civil War of the 1640s, 50s. There he says, in such a state of war, and it's just, he describes what I have previously described of the Second World War. In such a state of war, there is no place for industry, no culture of the earth, no instruments of moving, no arts, no letters, no society. But what is worst of all, there's a continual fear and danger of violent death. This is precisely the situation of warfare. The horror of this situation convinces human beings caught in this conflict at last that a better arrangement must be possible. An insight which, supported by fear of violent death and the desire for a better form of living, drives them into contract, into a contractual settlement designed to secure peace. In this settlement or compact, all participants must mutually agree to relinquish their unlimited freedom to do as they please, that is, to lay down their right to all things. What Hobbes calls in the natural condition, we have a right to all things. Jus ad omnia, we can have everything. And at the same time, they confer this right to a supreme or sovereign power which is able to enforce the terms of the contract. So we are now moving from the state of nature, conflict, to the civil state, which is governed by a sovereign power. Now, with this installation of supreme power, a new body comes into being, a commonwealth, an artifact or artificial body, which Hobbes, in his vivid Baroque language, calls the Leviathan, the body politic as the Leviathan. As he says in his introduction to that text, nature, he says, the act whereby God has made and governed the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so also in this imitated, that it can make an artificial animal, an artifact, a machine, an artificial animal. This art or technical capacity is shown in automata and in engines of many kinds. Yet, art goes even further, namely, by imitating that rational and most excellent work of nature, namely man or human being. For, he says, by art is created that great Leviathan, called commonwealth or state, which is but an artificial man, though of greater stature, greater strength than the natural man, for whose protection and defense it is intended. And sovereignty, what he calls sovereignty, is only an artificial soul giving life and motion to the body politic. So the sovereignty is the life stream, the energy which drives the body politic as an artifact. Now, in the section of the text which deals with the commonwealth, Hobbes makes it clear that the compact undergirding the body politic is not merely a harmonious order such as one finds sometimes among animals in nature. Rather, it erects a unified structure or body which is purely artificial. What unifies this body is a supreme and common power, which is based not on natural sympathy or good intentions, but on willpower, and fear. Now, the metaphysical and even theological premises of this construction are not left in doubt. Behind the constructed edifice of the body politic in Thomas Hobbes stands the image of divine omnipotence. A God characterized not so much by insight, love, or compassion, by a supreme power, a supreme will whose power has been transferred to the political sovereign, and subsidiarily to the citizens who construct the edifice by conferring to the sovereign their power and unbounded freedom. Hobbes continues in the same section of the Leviathan, and this is another vintage expression of Thomas Hobbes. Actually, he has a beautiful language. The English is just marvelous, very powerful, very energetic, the language he speaks. He says, "This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense." I'm on page 7. "For by this authority," he says, "given to him by every particular member in the Commonwealth, through the contract, the social contract, the sovereign has the use of so much power and strength conferred on him that by terror thereof he is enabled to form the will of them all." Now here is the beginning of a theory of terrorism. But state terror, the sovereign exercises state terror over the citizens. He's not yet talking about the terrorism coming from below. I turn to the second paragraph on page 7. Now, the Hobbesian formula of a technical construction of the body politics, which I have just tried to outline, became the dominant or canonical model of politics in Western thought, at least until the French Revolution. Although repeated attempts were made to modify, to re-articulate this idea, a particularly noteworthy attempt was undertaken by John Locke, often styled as the founder of modern Western liberalism, especially in his second treatise on government. In an accommodating fashion, Locke there combined aspects of the Aristotelian legacy with the Hobbesian artifact, but the former aspects were hardly able to camouflage the radical break with the tradition. Together with Hobbes, Hobbes started his arguments from the premise of an original, pre-social state of nature composed of separate individuals endowed with perfect liberty to pursue their self-interest. In his words, the natural condition of human beings, he says, is a state of perfect freedom to order their actions, dispose of their possessions as they see fit, without asking leave or depending on anybody else. For John Locke, echoing Aristotle, or rather a traditional Anglican priest, the perfect freedom of humans in the original state was hemmed in by the bounds of law of nature, and thus apparently involved more sociable dependence. Yet again, with Thomas Hobbes, John Locke's treatise concurs, I quote, that the execution of the law of nature in that state is put into every man's hands, whereby everyone has the right to punish others to such a degree as may hinder its violation. So John Locke gives as much power to deal with other human beings as Thomas Hobbes has done, and this means he can also kill competitors or those who transgress his bounds of freedom. Now, on the basis of these and subsequent steps, John Locke then develops his idea of a social contract, which is very similar to the Hobbesian contract, but I will not have time to go into this question here. One of the most important legacies of John Locke is this, and I paraphrase here, and I hope the translator is not going to get lost. one of the most important legacies is that in the state of nature, John Locke also assumes that individuals have a right of property, right of individual property, which then is transferred into the social or the political body or commonwealth and is maintained there just as it was in the original state of nature. Now, this was not yet very threatening or dangerous in the time of John Locke, when we lived in a basically agrarian society. But with the development of industrialization and the development of capitalism, the problem arose that property could be accumulated without any kind of limitations. And if you assume that in the state of nature people can accumulate any amount of property and that the state is not able or not entitled in any way to restrict or to limit this accumulation of property, then of course you have a situation where great social inequality is bound to result, namely an inequality between the very rich, those who have accumulated an enormous amount of property, of capital, and those who have not been able to accumulate this. So John Locke has a very peculiar role in the development of Western society, a very ambivalent role that needs to be reflected upon. But my point here is not so much the development of capitalism, but the idea of the body politic as an artificial body, as an artifact based on social contract. And this idea is continued from Thomas Hobbes to John Locke. John Locke does not modify it to a very great extent. And it then further continues in the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau at the early stages of the French Revolution, or preceding the French Revolution. I will not be able to discuss Rousseau to a great extent here. I only want to say this, that John Locke transfers the power of the sovereign power that Thomas Hobbes had outlined. He transfers it to the people at large, what he calls the general will of the people. So we have a different construction of sovereignty in Rousseau, different from the Hobbesian conception, where it was located in a king, a supreme power. We have it now in the people. And so to some extent, one can say that John Locke was the founder or the father of a people's republic or a people's democracy, a popular Leviathan, if you will. But the basic idea remains the same, namely that the body politic is an artificial body constructed through contract. So that's all I wanted to say. There are many differences between Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, but I don't have time to go into that. Okay, I'm now on page 11 for the translator, and I turn to the second part, developments in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. The model of the body politic as an artifact erected by social contract is, as I have said, the signature formula or the dominant formula of modern Western political thought. And its effects, of course, linger on even after the demise of its founders, even after the demise of the founding fathers of Western political thought or Western liberalism. This does not mean that the ensuing years did not bring radical changes or reformulations which steadily pushed the standard model or signature model into the background, reducing it to a residual resource. What particularly was eclipsed during the 19th century was the notion of a state of nature as an arena of radical freedom, a state of nature preceding the social state or the political state. The state of nature, this idea which was common to Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Rousseau. This is increasingly abundant, and with it the idea of a social contract. So the idea of state of nature, which then leads to a contract through which an artificial state is created, is increasingly abundant. Although treated even by its founders, by Hobbes and Locke, simply as a hypothetical premise rather than an actual occurrence, these ideas were bound to collide with the empirical scientific temper of the 19th century. What chiefly annoyed the devotees of what is called positivism, or the emerging natural scientism, were lingering metaphysical traces inherited from the earlier period. And let me just emphasize, I'm going to talk here about scientism, and as I'm critical of some aspects of scientism, is not meant to be in any way critical of modern science. So that distinction, I think, is important. So what annoyed some people of this kind of positivism or scientism were traces of a metaphysical kind inherited from an earlier age, especially traces which seem to animate the autonomy of human beings and their spontaneous constructive or engineering capability. For positivists, as well as for utilitarians and scientists of all kinds, all these legacies were what they call ghosts in the machine, which could be exorcised through rigorous reliance on science and causal scientific explanation. In the famous words of Jeremy Bentham, who was the founder of utilitarianism, the idea of a state of nature replete with natural rights is simply, he said, rhetorical nonsense on stilts. So the entire argument that from Thomas Hobbes through Locke to Rousseau is made about a state of nature with radical human rights, human freedom, leading through contract to a commonwealth is for Bentham is simply nonsense, rhetorical nonsense. Once these stilts are removed, the underlying mechanism of all human affairs come to the fore, namely the mechanism of pleasure and pain, of desire and fear, which equally governs both natural and artificial bodies. So during the 19th century, the spirit of the scientific age was carried forward, especially by the movement which I have called positivism, because of its stress on positive empirical knowledge and the exclusion of all metaphysical or ontological premises. And I'm now at the middle of page 12. What this movement aimed at was the triumph of an empiricist method which alone can grant positive knowledge of the facts and things of immediate perception, as they said, as well as the relations and uniformities which inquiry must discover through empirical experience. By common consent, the leading sponsor of this movement was a philosopher by the name of Auguste Comte, who gained prominence through his system of positive polity, or the Catechism of Positivism of 1952. Now, in these and related texts, Auguste Comte developed a new discipline, or a science, which he first called a social physics, and later simply sociology. This new science for him involved two branches, social statics and social dynamics, where the former deals with the existing network of practices and ideas, while the latter examines the development and evolution of society through the three stages of theology, metaphysics, and science. Now, in the domain of evolution, and I'm on page 13 now, the first paragraph. In the domain of evolution, the positivist scientific agenda was implemented by the biologist Charles Darwin, whose Origin of the Species traced the organic development in physical nature not to some intentional design or purpose of will, but to a process of natural selection, in which the more fit type of species advance at the cost of the weaker organisms. Now, although initially confined narrowly by Darwin to the biological domain, some of Darwin's ideas were soon transferred from biology to the social and political domain, where they gave rise to such doctrines as the social struggle for survival and the survival of the socially most fit. So it's a doctrine which enhances a kind of state of nature within society. This transfer was accomplished chiefly by the British theorist Herbert Spencer, in whose writings evolution was shown to be a process of complex differentiation and recoordination, but a quasi-mechanical process devoid of any intent or acceptable purpose across the board from physics to society and politics. I turn to page 14 here. Now, with regard to motivation, Spencer could rely on a psychological doctrine which by then was well established, namely the doctrine of utilitarianism, articulated chiefly by Jeremy Bentham, whom I have mentioned before. In his famous introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation of 1789, Bentham had stated the basic premise in clear terms. As he said, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is from them alone that we can point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do, in effect. Pleasure and pain are the sensations which provide us with, he says, the standard of right and wrong, while nature anchors these sensations in a chain of causes and effects. So it's a scientific explanation of all human occurrences, of biological occurrences, of social and political phenomena. Also contested occasionally, positivism and utilitarianism became the dominant paradigms of the 19th and early 20th century, whose ramifications and offshoots penetrate deeply even into recent philosophical developments. Now, I shall not dwell here at great lengths on these very complex offshoots and subsequent developments. I merely want to unearth some basic principles regarding the body politic. Now, for my purposes here, I draw attention especially to some very recent philosophical developments which are associated with the notion of postmodernism. And I want to show how these traces of positivism and utilitarianism even linger in some aspects of recent postmodernism. And I turn for this purpose to page 16. And I lift up for attention a recent text published in 2001, which is called Political Physics, whose title already clearly evokes the legacy of Auguste Comte, who had defined his enterprise as social physics. So we have now political physics. In this text, the author, by name of John Protevi, focuses on the work of two leading postmodern thinkers, namely Jacques Derrida and Gilles Deleuze, with the aim, he says, of exploring their respective approaches to the question of the body politic. So we are back to the body politic. And what I want to show here is the lingering influence of positivism and scientism in recent times, and even in the work of some leading philosophers of postmodernism. Now, among the two thinkers, Derrida and Deleuze, Protevi acknowledges that Derrida is less helpful and at best provides a gateway to a political physics, properly speaking. Although, he says, destroying the self-evidence of various traditional and metaphysical systems, Derrida, he says, can only prepare the way for the radicality of Deleuzian historical materialism. The principles guiding the empirical study of what he calls forceful bodies politic in their material production. I turn to page 17 here. Now, according to the author, to Protevi, Deleuze's work, Gilles Deleuze, brings the potential contained in this approach to full development and full fruition in a manner distantly akin to the notions of biopower and micropolitics which had been employed by Michel Foucault. Deleuze, in his analysis, engages, he says, all the powers of contemporary physics and biology to study, he says, sectors of the contemporary global system which gleefully embrace difference and flow. Three main ideas, according to him, are at work in this new enterprise. Those, he calls, first, forceful bodies, secondly, anti-hylomorphism, and secondly, material self-ordering. The first notion refers to particular force arrangements of chemical, biological, and social bodies, which are themselves force constellations and hence forceful bodies politic. The denial of hylomorphism means the rejection of purposely designed artifacts, that is, the imposition of an architect's vision or form on chaotic matter. The last notion of material self-ordering refers to the immanent, non-purposive arrangement of elements in accord with recent, what is called, complexity theory. Now, although impressive in its radicality and its display of neo-positivist terminology, political physics in the end is bound to leave the reader puzzled, at least me as a reader leaves puzzled or at sea. When I'm in the bottom of page 17 here, where in all this array of forces, of forceful bodies, is there room for human beings with their joys and sufferings? Are they simply cogs in a self-propelled mechanism? How does complexity theory deal with the whims of political power? How do forceful bodies protect us against injustice, corruption, oppression, and torture? So these are the questions I raised at the end, and they are directed at positivism and the remnants of positivism in our time, which reduce all of politics to a physical process. And so I turn in the last section, my paper on page 18, to politics as what I call politics as embodied praxis. Now, the issues of injustice, corruption, and oppression, or as we say at this conference of catastrophe, brings to the fore aspects of political life which no theory of politics, no matter how scientifically sophisticated, no matter how positively sophisticated it may be, can safely ignore, especially in our time. More than in any other period, our age has been afflicted with a deluge of injustice, oppression, and corruption, ills accompanied by extensive mayhem and violent atrocities. To a greater or lesser extent, all the major worldviews or ideologies of modernity have contributed to these afflictions. To compound this series of afflictions, or these catastrophes, all the modern worldviews, from liberalism and socialism to positivism and utilitarianism, have been wedded to the unlimited pursuit of positive scientism, of the technological exploitation of nature. A pursuit whose trajectory conjures up the dual calamities of nuclear holocaust and ecological destruction. And let me remind you again, I'm talking about scientism, not about science itself. To be sure, the picture of modernity I have given here is somewhat simplified and overdrawn. Throughout the modern era, we find recessed counter-movements, counter-tendencies, which challenge the focus on self-interest, on self-indulgence, on individual and collective self-pursuit. A prominent counter-movement of this type was a group of Scottish moralists in the 1800s, from Francis Hutcheson and Adam Ferguson, Thomas Reid, who sought to counterbalance unlimited self-interest with the motivation of compassion and the role of transformative education. Another counter-tendency was the vogue of German classical literature, of Goethe and Schiller, philosophers, classical philosophers, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Schelling. A vogue continued and modified by later Romanticism from Schlegel and Hölderlin to Wordsworth and Shelley. In more recent times, other valuable resources for a counter-perspective to this kind of positivism and scientism are provided by American pragmatism, William James, John Dewey, European phenomenology and hermeneutics, Martin Heidegger, Gadamer, Merleau-Ponty, and the worldwide renewal of neo-Aristotelianism or Aristotelian virtue ethics, Alasdair MacIntyre, Tu Wei Ming, and many others. What emerges from this confluence of currents is a reassessment of the meaning of politics, above all, the meaning of the body politic. If these currents are taken seriously, then the body politic, I believe, can no longer be viewed, as it was with Thomas Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, can no longer be viewed as a mere artificial construct created through contract and for purely external or instrumental purposes, such as economic wealth, security, or national glory. Nor can the body politic be seen as a mere assemblage of physical nerves and corpuscles held together by complexity. Also not reducible to a mental idea, the body politic is also more than just a libidinal body, as it is constructed or as it articulated by Gilles Deleuze, a libidinal body. If by libido we mean a unilateral desire for appropriation and self-gratification. A better way to describe the body politic, in my view, would be to call it an affective, solicitous, or caring body, where all members are linked together through mutual ethical engagement and a shared commitment to justice and general well-being. So this is the alternative of the body politic that I propose, an alternative both to the artificial body politic of Thomas Hobbes and alternative to the merely physical body as constructed by Auguste Comte and positivism, utilitarianism, and so forth. Now, a body of this kind was clearly involved in Aristotle's treatment of the political community as an arena of ethical practice. A practice geared not toward the achievement of extrinsic aims like wealth, power, glory, but toward the intrinsic good of political practice. Political practice for Aristotle has an intrinsic good by itself, namely the formation and transformation of human beings into responsible citizens. As he pointed out in his ethical writings, civic virtues are not simply innate qualities, but need to be practiced like other human abilities in a concrete public context. Just like piano playing or flute playing, Aristotle insisted, we do not play the piano for another purpose in order to do something else, or play the flute in order to do something else, or make money, or have some kind of glory. The practice carries within its own good or reward. In this case, the achievement of public happiness and peace. Thus, virtues need to be indeed embodied. They need to be embodied. They need to be practiced. If you play the piano, you have to be embodied. You sit on the piano daily and practice and practice. That's an embodied, a bodily practice. And so also virtues need to be bodily practiced in a society, in a context. So they have to be embodied, but not in a machine or in a selfish libidinal organism, but in a shared, responsive, affectionate body, which Aristotle called civic friendship. Civic friendship. Now I turn to the last paragraph on page 20. Among more recent thinkers, glimpses of such an affective body politic can be found, I believe, in some of the texts of Merleau-Ponty and Martin Heidegger. For the former, for Merleau-Ponty, the human body was never an isolated cauldron of libidinal impulses, but always a shared body, an interbody, an intersubjective body, carefully negotiating the crossroads between self and other, sameness and difference, familiarity and strangeness. For this reason, the body, including the body politic, was never a finished product, but always a becoming body, a body undergoing the process of formation and transformation. His posthumously published text, titled The Visible and the Invisible, speaks intriguingly of what he calls the flesh of the world, characterized by intertwining, by reversibility, a passage showing that, he says, there is neither me nor the other as positive subjectivities, but rather there are two caverns, two opennesses, two stages where something will take place. Accordingly, flesh for Merleau-Ponty is not an objective or physical body, nor the body posited by the cogito as a property or as a construct or as an artifact. Rather, it is sensuality or sensibility in the twofold sense, namely of what senses and what one senses. Now, I'm on page 21. Similar glimpses can also be gleaned from the writings of Martin Heidegger, provided his central notion of being, which he borrowed from Aristotle, is not seen as an abstract category, as a substantive or noun, but rather as a verb, with the result that being is always a becoming, an enabling potency which allows all beings to be. Heidegger's famous phrase of letting be, letting others be. That doesn't mean indifference, it means allowing, helping others to be what they can be, the best they can be. So, letting be. In the same way, human being, or what he calls Dasein, is likewise involved in continuous becoming or formation, a process, moreover, which is accompanied by affect or mood, Stimmung, which in turn is anchored in the central category of care or solicitude. It is true that Heidegger himself did not fully work out the implications of his thought for politics, or the body politics, but some recent scholars have taken promising steps in this direction, and I also have taken some hopefully promising steps in that direction. We'll see how promising. Now, if the political community is really embodied, then all its members share in the happiness and flourishing of that body, but also all the members share in its sufferings, in its calamities, and its catastrophes, if we are really such a sharing body. As indicated before, political communities in recent times have been exposed to particularly grievous battery of calamities. Under the aegis of globalization, these ills have been magnified, extended to the level of the global community. If these are the major calamities, and I believe my diagnosis is not far off the mark, my diagnosis of these calamities and catastrophes, then what are the needed remedies? What are the needed cures if these are the calamities, as I have pointed out? Now, fortunately, in these matters, we are not entirely left ignorant or at sea. We have the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, but also the teachings of the great thinkers in other cultures, the teachings of Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd in the Muslim tradition, Confucius, Mencius in the Confucian tradition, and of course also the Buddhist sutras. What all these teachings counsel is, I believe, is a turnaround, or what is called a metanoia, a turning around, a metanoia, namely a turning from the radical pursuit of self-interest to the search for the common good, or what Aristotle called the good life. For all of them, this turning requires the steady practice of civic virtues. by way of conclusion, I want to invoke the marvelous remedies. If we have all these calamities, all these catastrophes which afflict the body of humanity today, then there are marvelous remedies proposed by the Mahatma Gandhi. He called them two things, the ahimsa and satyagraha. Ahimsa, non-violence, but does not just mean the non-infliction of violence, but the steady practice of non-violence in the sense of the cultivation of solicitude, of compassion, of caring for the other. Satyagraha, in turn, means the pursuit, the steady pursuit of a living truth, of ethical goodness, of justice, of embodied sensibility and beauty. These, I am convinced, are the guideposts whose observance yields social happiness and peace and well-being, and whose neglect, I believe, yields inevitably misery, destruction, and catastrophe. Thank you.
네, 기조 강연을 해주신 달마열 교수님 다시 한번 감사드립니다. 우리가 잠깐 질문하는 시간을 좀 갖고자 합니다. 여러분 질문하실 거 있으면 동시통역이 되고 있기 때문에 편하신 언어로 질문하시면 되겠습니다. 손들어 펴주시면 마이크를 전달해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 교수님 먼저 진행하도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you. I can accept that. This is too loud. I can accept that the establishment of a government or a leviathan or a body politic has significantly contributed to maintaining peace. But nowadays, the most important problems are international: global warming, global economic crisis, global famine, and things like that. Do you expect that we humans will be able to establish some kind of body politic at the international level in the near future? Or if not, do you have to rely on some superpowers or some group of small number of nations playing the role of a leviathan? Is that desirable or unavoidable?
I hope we will not have a super leviathan. I'm a very fervent supporter of the United Nations and its affiliate associations, UNESCO, World Health Organization, and so forth. But I don't want them to develop into a super leviathan. No, this is the remedy by default. If we don't do anything better, then this will be the result. That's the only thing we have to fall back. So as I agree that Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is always the default possibility. And in fact, this is what the Western world, what America to a very large extent now falls back on. The security state, everything is under the governance of security and anti-terrorism. So we are basically falling back into a Hobbesian model. And I don't want this to be transferred to the international level. So this is the default. So what is the positive advantage? Well, the positive advantage I have called the dialogue of civilization. That is what Khatami has called the dialogue of civilization as an alternative to the clash of civilization. Now, this requires a lot of practice of these civic virtues, which we are completely unaccustomed to practice anything like this. If we want to have a well-flourishing city or state or international community, we have to practice them just like a piano player has to practice his damn piano every day. There's no shortcut to that. So that would mean a strengthening of some kind of a moral fiber in the world community. I realize this is very difficult, but it's, I think, the underlying motivation, the presupposition of everything else. Of course, as a subsidiary remedy, I also acknowledge the role of institutions, of authority and of power. Of course, they come in, but I just hope that power doesn't always trump everything else, as it does in modern Western society.
Thank you.
You alluded to the notion that somehow the modern world is more violent, and I'm wondering if recently my friend Steve Pinker has produced a rather massive tome arguing that the world has become progressively less violent and provide data. And I think the implicit argument is that science and rationality have played a role in reducing violence over time. And I wonder if you wanted to comment on that.
Well, that's a very hopeful statement. I'm just thinking of the potential of violence that we have today, which no previous age could have mastered.
Absolutely.
I mean, we have the potential of destroying the world, 50 times over through the atomic bomb. And it's not only a possibility, the atomic bomb has been dropped, and not far from here. One of my recommendations is for all the schools, that all schools in all the world should visit Hiroshima once. Ought to visit Hiroshima once and Nagasaki, to become morally alerted to the dangers that inflict the world, to the catastrophes which are looming out there. Do you know that the great powers in the world, they are constantly amplifying their military arsenals, refining their military arsenals. And there's very little of disarmament going on in the world today. In addition to that, of course, we have the destructive force of global warming. And there are many people who are totally ignorant, or not ignorant, they simply deny it. They are in self-denial. There's a mode of self-denial. And much of it has to do with a ignorance of science, or refusal to admit the findings of science. There's a very, very enormous dangers. Now, for this, one needs an awakening, awakens to the dangers which loom out there. But I find that much of humanity today is sort of like in dream walking, somnambulist, like in sleepwalking outside and not being aware of all the dangers that loom so powerfully all over the place. So my vision of the future is somewhat grim, unless there is some kind of awakening going on. If the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan are now being reduced or being ending, I'm very much afraid that there's already a great search going on for the next victim. That's my fear, and that can be total catastrophe. So yeah. So basically, my point was maybe my paper was a bit too convoluted and maybe designed too much for political scientists who study this as a profession, But the basic is very simple. We had this conception of the social animal living in a harmonious community in ancient times, then it's followed by the constructive artificial body in modern times, then the positivism into some kind of libidinal body. And I've been trying to urge a certain, not nostalgic return, but a remembrance of alternatives which are possible, which are there, which are in our tradition and which are in the Asian traditions, which are in Confucianism, which are in Buddhism and Taoism, to remember again the way, the teaching of the way, the Tao, which we have to follow in order to save this universe, this humanity, It's not just an academic exercise, It's a survival. It's a matter of survival. For me, the recovery of some of these ancient teaching of Asian philosophy, a matter of survival, really. That's how I see it.
벌써 15분이 넘어서요. 다음 세션이 또 이어지니까요. 그때 또 연이어서 질문해 주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 네, 지금부터 한 약 15분간 여러분 휴식을 하시고요. 3시부터 first session 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 여러분 대단히 감사합니다. Thank you very much, Dallmayr. Please.